Well, and a lot of what you're describing with agribusiness management and with marketing, is obviously very relevant to those within the value chain. What about for people more upstream? For a farmer that might ask, like, how much of this do I really need to care about? Like, how much of this really needs to enter my own kind of farm business management mindset when it comes to marketing? Because I come from a commodity trading background where farm marketing meant like managing risk with basis and futures. But now my interest is much more on the marketing in the more pure sense of like kind of that push pull concept you were talking about earlier. How do you answer that question about how much a farmer needs to be tuned in to the current trends in agricultural markets?
Well, okay, I'll answer it in two ways. The first part is that even though not everybody buys your corn directly from you, everybody does vote. And so, I mean, for example, one of the papers that I published early in my career was on Prop 2 in California. When the majority of California consumers end up voting for something that they buy on a regular basis or voting against something that they buy on a regular basis, sorry, there is something that matters here. I think in that regard, we in ag often believe that we just need to tell our story louder. I think that the challenge there is that when we tell our story, there's a song in our head that we can't not hear. That if the consumer has never heard that song before, they have no idea where you're coming from, right? So it's important to have a two-way conversation with those people. And that's, I think, partly why this matters. The other reason why I think this discussion about biases, et cetera, matter in the marketplace is because of this concept called the bullwhip effect. So the bullwhip effect is this really popular idea in supply chain management where small unanticipated changes at the consumer level can create larger and larger issues down the supply chain. So when we think about COVID, you had this unanticipated shift in consumer demand that nobody was expecting. We planned out our biological lagged process to hit the number of chicken wings that we needed for March Madness. And then March Madness doesn't happen. And now we have a ton of chicken wings. Right. And so we saw that in the data for chicken wings, where chicken wing prices went super low and then they popped back up because there wasn't the same type of demand. And it created these huge ripple effects for poultry. I mean, we could talk about it with eggs, right? So you had consumers who stopped going to restaurants. And so the breaking stock egg prices went down below the cost of bottled water. But the shell egg prices at the grocery store went through the roof. And everybody remembers the shell egg prices, but had they just bought the liquid eggs, they would have been able to save a lot of money. And so these shifts are in large part induced by the biases. And the last thing that I guess I should say is farmers are subject to just the same number of biases, right? So we've got a paper where we were looking at conservation tillage from about 10 years ago. There was this long-term project where they were looking at increasing conservation tillage practices in Michigan soybeans. The researchers were a little bit frustrated because they would make recommendations and the farmers wouldn't listen to them. And so I asked the simple question of, well, who are these farmers and how well do they know each other? Are you getting individual observations? Are they making individual choices, or is this kind of a group think piece? And so we actually asked the farmers in the operations to or in the experimental sets to talk about how well they knew each other. And with that social network matrix, we could predict tillage intensity. And we found that the more socially connected you were, the more social pressure you were feeling, the less likely you were to adopt the new tillage practice. Right. So there are all types of biases that exist at the consumer level, and we can talk about those, but those biases also exist down the supply chain as well.
This brings up a question in my mind of basically, do people really change? Period. And from an economist perspective, a lot of times what you're looking at is people's choices. How do you wrestle with that question of like, do people really change, or are we just going to have an AI model that can pretty much predict how everyone's going to react to everything in the future?
Uh, I mean, there are fundamental principles that I think we can typically hold to be true. So I teach in our executive level MSMBA program, which is honestly it's the most unique graduate program I've ever seen. You get an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and an MS from us in Ag Econ. The way that I kicked off the class this semester was talking about markets. We created what was called a double oral auction market, which is very deep. Like the guy who won the Nobel Prize in economics at Purdue University, he invented it. And in that market interaction, if I can set my supply and demand curves the way that I expect them to exist, I can predict the equilibrium price and quantity with about 80, 95% accuracy. It depends on the group, but it is shockingly accurate what we can determine with simple economic models. And so, are people messy in their decision making? Yeah, but in an iterative process, usually we can make these predictions on the fly. So I say that to maybe support this idea that people aren't going to change and maybe they shouldn't. But what can change, I think, is the rules of the game or the trends that are surrounding them. Here's an example that I think is super interesting. I was working with a horticulture professor at Michigan State, and she was talking about how the floriculture industry, the greenhouses in urban areas, always assumed that everybody wants to pick out their own flowers. And so they didn't think they needed to worry about online ordering very much because at the end of the day, yes, you want a tulip, but you're going to pick out that tulip yourself. Well, as it has turned out, there is a massive market for online flower sales. And you know that market is very expensive because the shipping costs are super high at the equilibrium price. But it was something that industry is going to have to deal with. And are they going to change? Well, they sure better because the consumer has changed in the way that they buy things.
It's yeah, the that stuff really interests me, and kind of the different business models that come from changes like that. Is that something that you economists explore? Is kind of like, obviously you are researching the changes that are happening, and a lot of times when I see economists give presentations, it's usually pretty macro trend oriented. But who's really kind of digging into what business models come as a result from some of these changes? Is that something that you look at as well?
So that's something that I want to write in the next book. Is really just unpacking these novel business models that have been developed over the last 40 years. One that no one outside of agriculture understands is cooperatives, right? So how do cooperative models engage with the modern world? There are kind of the old generation cooperatives and these new era cooperatives. What do those look like? I think you know, people talk about agriculture, and you know this, that people like to say it like it's one thing, and the reality is that like it is hundreds, if not thousands, of things that are just somehow woven together to get the clothes on your back and the food on your plate. And so, you know, who is working on what? Well, it depends on the industry that we're discussing. For your listeners, I think the best place to start is whatever state you're in, go pay attention to what their agricultural economics department is doing in state. When I lived in Michigan, we didn't have any rice economists on the payroll, right? But then I got down to Arkansas and we had like four rice economists. I still don't really feel like I know that much about rice. I learned more than I ever thought I would, but every single place is going to have its own nuances and its own unique needs. And so I think about a lot of this stuff, I suppose, at the macro level, just like we all do. But if you want to get into the weeds, I promise you, you can find an agricultural economist for you.